Nothing Important Podcast. This is actually take 2 with Eric from Tugboat Coffee. Let's go. Again. All right, Eric, how's it going, buddy?
Very good. How are you guys doing?
Very good. For those of you listening, it's just kind of a funny snafu. Our equipment kind of goofed up on us, so Eric and I were talking for about 15 minutes, and it was unusable, right, Dave?
It's totally unusable.
so we're going to go again. We're actually sitting here with Eric Barkley of the Tugboat Coffee, and he's going to talk to us today about like his company, what he does, and he's going to educate some of us people that aren't really coffee aficionados.
Awesome.
But maybe now I have some information. Maybe I can ask a few questions.
Yeah, so Eric, I hope you remember everything that you just said for the last 15 minutes, okay?
Yeah.
You ready to go?
We'll try to recreate it.
Verbatim if possible. Please.
Verbatim. I want exact word for word inflection and everything.
Got
Okay?
We were just talking about how, when you do a session, you have to repeat yourself to, the same thing over and over again. So we do that for interviews. This is all a big setup. We just want you to, we're going to copy together later, get a better take.
So I own Tugboat Coffee. I'm the owner and the roaster, and we're in Addison, Illinois. And we supply coffee to coffee shops, restaurants, and like specialty retail stores throughout Chicago and the Midwest. Coffee is pretty much all I think about every day.
And you ship to order online, right?
Yeah, we do online retail. We don't have a retail storefront or anything. We never will. We're just a wholesale manufacturing center, so we ship online. But otherwise, it's all out to coffee shops. Okay,
perfect. And just so we know, where exactly can we find more information about Tugboat Coffee on the internet?
Yeah, it's tugboatcoffee.com.
Tugboatcoffee.com.
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay, Eric, so Dave and I, we know very little about coffee. I'm going to admit it, but part of what we do here at the Nothing Important Podcast is we love talking to people who are genuinely passionate about what they do. We want to find out what makes you tick, how you go through your process. So as the head chief, awesome brewmaster, Omega founder guy of Tugboat Coffee, why don't you run us through how exactly long have you been in the coffee business?
So I got my start in coffee down in Gainesville, Florida. Initially, I started at Starbucks. It was just a part-time job to help pay my way through college, and started drinking coffee there, but it wasn't true coffee. I was drinking coffee with a lot of chocolate, milk, or all the other stuff in it.
And you didn't, when you were in Florida, you went to University of Florida, Gainesville, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And your original career path of choice was
marine biology. So
marine biology. That's quite a stretch going from giving physicals to whales and sea turtles to brewing coffee.
Yeah, so I'm from Chicago originally. Went to Glenbard West. And went to the University of Florida to be near the ocean, obviously. Wanted to do marine biology, and after I started, loved the courses and everything. Saw how much a marine biologist actually made for a living, and decided that I wanted to do something more lucrative. So I switched my major to marketing, and I think it was one of the bigger mistakes in my life to give up something that I really wanted to do. Fortunately, after I worked at Starbucks, I saw that there was a lot more to the coffee industry, so I started working at independent coffee shops. And I worked as a barista for 6 years down there, and then I started roasting for 2 years in Florida. And I found the exact same passion that I had for marine biology and coffee. And luckily, after my first mistake, I knew I wasn't going to leave the coffee industry after that. I'd found something else that I was really passionate about and loved working in.
Was there any aha moment, like any moment where you're like, okay, this is exactly what I want to do? Or was it like a slow build up? You just kind of started working. You're like, oh, okay, this is interesting. Or was there any particular moment where you're like, you know what, coffee is the life for me. This is where I need to go.
So it was more of a slow build up, but Ethiopian Harar coffee was really what set me on the path to trying to find more about coffee and learning as much as I possibly could.
And what exactly is Ethiopian Harar?
So Ethiopian Harar, the Harar region of Ethiopia is a coffee growing region, and they're known for their naturally processed coffees. And an Ethiopian Harar coffee, a good coffee, will taste like you just smashed blueberries in a cup when you grind it. And it was when I smelled Ethiopian Harar being ground for the first time, and it didn't even smell like coffee. And I served it to people and just saw the reaction. I fell in love with coffee and just wanted to learn as much as I possibly could. So
right, and that's what we find very interesting, because Dave and I, we have this idea of what coffee should smell like, right? Like, because most of our experience would probably be some brand of coffee like Folgers or something like that.
Dirty feet.
Dirty feet. Well, like we talked about
Keurigs,
like Keurigs and like
dirty feet,
mass-produced coffee like the Downs and such. They're a little bit more bitter taste, but that's not the kind of coffee that you do. You do coffee that's more flavorful and sweet, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the crop, coffee as a crop is the most labor-intensive crop, I think, in the world, actually. Everything is done by hand, besides Brazil, which does a little bit of mechanization of the harvesting. All the cherries ripen at different times, so every single day somebody has to go out into the coffee fields and pick the cherries by hand, the ones that are ripe.
So it's hand-on. Every time you have a coffee bean, somebody has plucked that. It wasn't like a big machine running down the field. There's somebody there grabbing it by hand, putting it in the basket, and bringing it to where it needs to go.
Yeah, and the Arabica coffee, which is primarily what we drink in the U.S., is grown at very high elevations. So near the equator, it's up as high as like 7,000 feet.
What does the higher elevation do for?
So the higher elevation, you want a very slow development of the cherries. You don't want them to grow really quickly. So at the high elevations, you have cold nights that do not go to below freezing, though, so that the cherries develop very slowly, and that allows them to develop more flavors in the coffee as well. Okay. So all the countries that are really close to the equator, if you want a really good coffee, you have to go way up into the mountains. So if you go further away from the equator, such as growing coffee in Mexico, you could have a lower elevation of maybe 4,000 feet for an Arabica coffee. You also have Robusta, which generally we don't drink in the U.S., which would be grown at elevations around 2,000 feet, which has a much higher caffeine content, but it's also not a pleasant coffee to drink. It's very low-grade coffee.
Robusto?
Robusta.
Oh, Robusta?
Yeah.
So like robust, like full of flavors, what comes to mind?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So Arabica...
like it's less coffee flavor.
A little more bang for the buck, like...
Yeah. Yeah, so the really big coffee companies, Folgers and stuff like that, they'll use, because it's also much less expensive. There's not as much demand for it. They will blend that with Arabica coffees. There's also a lot of other things that go into the ground coffee you get in Folgers, but it's not pure Arabica coffee, which is what you find at specialty coffee houses and specialty retailers.
Oh, very cool, very cool. So how do you go about actually finding where to buy the coffee beans from? Because it's not like we can go to like Indiana or Wisconsin. Like, I can't drive up to the Dells and be like, yo, farmer, I want 2 tons of coffee. How do you actually go through the process of actually finding suppliers of your coffee?
Right. So the U.S. only has one place that we grow coffee, and that's in Hawaii. And it makes it very expensive to grow coffee there, because the hand picking and the labor involved in harvesting the coffee is really expensive in the U.S. So most of the coffee comes from Central, South America, East Africa, Indonesia, and Asia. China has a huge developing specialty coffee market. They're growing incredible coffee. Indonesia is really known for their Sumatran coffees. And then East Africa just has these unbelievable, really sweet, fruity coffees, which is where my preference lies, is with East African coffees. But depending on where I'm getting the coffee from, I have different importers that actually travel to those countries 4 or 5 times a year to inspect the process of the coffees and the harvesting of the coffees, to make sure that when we get it here in the States 3 to 6 months later, that it's the same quality that we expect and that we're paying for. So for any small roaster to actually go to these farms and source the coffee themselves to truly determine that they're getting the same coffee and high quality coffee, they'd have to be going there several times a year. So it's not realistic. So I have importers that I use, 3 importers I use on a regular basis, and then several others that I use on an infrequent basis that actually go there, source the coffee, and then I pay them for their fees and of actually importing it. But there's so many places that something can go wrong with the coffee, and just in terms of when it's picked, how it's processed, even up to how it's shipped. So to give you an example, I had a Indonesian coffee last year. I had a bunch of bags of this coffee, and it was all unbelievable coffee, just perfect. I got to the last bag that I had, and it was a completely different color. The coffee should be like a really nice green color when I get it, and it was all discolored, and it was simply because it was on the outside of the shipping container. So it's traveling from Jakarta all the way up around the top of Africa, usually a stop in Europe somewhere, and then over to New Jersey. So in that entire process, just the heat pounding down on that shipping container completely changed the characteristics of the bean because it was on the outside of the shipping container. It was receiving a lot of heat. So there's just a lot of places that can go wrong before it actually gets to your cup.
When you go to purchase beans and you're looking for certain flavors and such, do you have to take into account seasons in other parts of the world, or since it's primarily tropical regions, there's consistency there?
No, yeah, there's with the exception of Brazil, which actually has irrigation and stuff, they are producing 11 months out of the year, and it's consistent pretty much all year as well. There's a heavy rain season in most of these countries and a light rain season. So the heavy rain season produces the really good crops, a lot of coffee during that season. And then it takes a long time to process it and actually ship it over here. But there's also the light rain season that we can get coffees from. Generally, they're not as good. It's a much lower yield as well. But generally, the coffees aren't as good. There's always exceptions. But Kenya actually calls it the fly crop for their light rain season. So I try to get the coffees from the countries when they're actually in season at their peak of harvest and producing the best quality coffees.
So do you have to buy like a pretty large advanced amount then? Because if it goes into the next season, then like you said, it'll decrease the quality. Do you have to buy an advanced amount?
So green coffee actually has like a 2-year shelf life.
Oh.
I work with certain coffees. I do about a 12-month inventory. And then my East African coffees, because I'm obsessive over East African coffees, I only do a 6-month inventory with East African coffee. So I offer those seasonally. And it's a very small reason. I mean, they lose a little bit of brightness and acidity after 6 months. Most 99.9% of people wouldn't notice any difference between a 6-month-old East African and a year-old East African. But just since that's what I drink primarily, I can tell the difference.
Yeah, but you'll know, right?
Right, exactly.
But that's great, because if you know, it shows that you're passionate, you know your business, and even though somebody like me might not be able to taste the difference, you know, you're tasting it and you're making sure that you're putting the best possible product out there.
Right. And it definitely leads to much more difficult inventory practices. You have to make a very religious checklist on the coffees, and it also sometimes upsets customers. They get used to having certain coffee, and then it's gone, and I'm not going to have it again for another 6 months. So there's a lot of other issues that are created by doing that. But for that 0.1% of the people that are going to be able to tell a difference between a 6-month-old East African and a year-old East African, I'm doing it to please that 0.1%. The South American and Central American coffees, they're not very acidic coffees in general, so it doesn't really make that much of a difference. And that's a really common coffee for people who use as a house coffee in their coffee shops. So those I do a 12-month inventory on. Some of the Indonesian coffees I do a 12-month inventory as well. But like the Brazil, they're producing 11 months out of the year. I can get a bag of Brazil. It tastes identical pretty much any month of the year. So it's not a big issue with inventory there.
How many I guess flavors? It would be coffee flavors?
Coffee origins.
Okay.
Origins.
How many do you currently have right now?
Right now, I have 10, and
Wow.
actually, I actually want to reduce that. I prefer to have a very small selection, and that's, I think, will lead people to come to get those specific coffees from me. It takes a lot of time to develop a roast profile for each coffee. After maybe 130 pounds of roasting a coffee, I'll actually start selling it to a coffee shop. So it cost me a lot of money to actually develop a roast profile. So once I find one and once I have it perfected, I don't really want to switch away from that coffee again.
So I want to talk about that in a moment, like how you actually go through the roast profile and such. But you actually brought some coffee as a sample for us, correct?
Yeah, so this is a Guatemalan coffee. It comes from one farm. It's called Finca El Injertal, and it's a family-run business. It's been in the exact same family for about 200 years now.
Wow.
And they just have been doing things from the beginning very ethically. They've set up nature preserves on their plantation for all the native plants and species. It's shade grown, so there's actual natural foliage over the coffee instead of like netting or something like that to provide a synthetic shade for the plants. And they're producing, in my opinion, one of the best Central American coffees in the world. It's just an unbelievable coffee, very consistent. I've had it for a couple of years now, and it's every single year it just seems to get better and better. I've obviously been in the trade for a long time, so they know exactly what to do with processing and harvesting. And when I get every single bag, the beans look identical from one bag to the next, which is fairly unusual for coffee. So I found an incredible farm, and actually plan on visiting this farm relatively soon.
Nice. So is your Guatemalan coffee available on your website?
Yes. Yeah, we have it.
Do you only sell to retail, or you can sell? If somebody buys a bag, you can send them a bag.
Yeah, we can do retail. We don't have a retail location. We're just a roastery, so we're not necessarily open to the public, but they can purchase coffee online, and we roast the Guatemala. All of our coffee shops, we roast on demand, so we don't carry anything in our inventory roasted. We roast for that coffee shop, and then whatever is not sold, we actually donate to a local charity. So unlike a big bulk roaster that McDonald's, gas stations, those type of places are carrying, those coffees, or even a grocery store, those coffees are usually sitting on a shelf for 6 months before they're ever sent out.
Oh, wow.
So with all of my coffee shops and retailers, we try to work on a 2-week inventory. So I can tell a difference after a coffee's 2 weeks old. Most people wouldn't be able to tell a difference till it's about a month old. But again, we're trying to just produce the best possible cup of coffee for the customers at a coffee shop.
Right. The point is, right? Like,
yeah,
you're
exactly.
the expert. Right? It has to meet your standards. Like, it doesn't matter if I, Dave. It doesn't matter if Dave and Brian know the difference. The fact is that you know the difference.
Yeah, there is a difference.
Then it's gonna ensure that it's the best possible cup of coffee that you could be providing for the people who would pick it up.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So I work very closely with all the managers and owners of the coffee shops to make sure that we're working on at most 2-week inventory. I have a lot of coffee shops that work on a week inventory. So they're literally brewing all the coffee that they get that same week and then reordering the following week. So it's a lot of work to produce coffee that way, but it absolutely makes a tremendous difference in the quality of the coffee.
So let's talk about the actual process of making the coffee. Right, you have a huge roasting machine, right?
It's large. It's not anything near what Starbucks or McDonald's would be roasting on. I actually just got a chance to see one of Starbucks roasters. It was a 2,200 kilo roaster. It's actually being manufactured right up in Vernon Hills, and you can walk through the roaster. It's that big.
Oh my God!
So I roast on the same manufacturer that Starbucks is using. It's the company's called Probat. And their U.S. headquarters is right here in Chicago. But so mine is a 12 kilo. There's 2.2 pounds in a kilo. So technically I could do like 24 pounds in a batch. Most I do is really 20 pounds, usually about 15-pound batches. And then you lose a lot of weight during the roasting process, 20 to 30% of the weight. So you actually only get, 12, 13 pounds out of a 15-pound batch.
And how long does a batch take to roast?
It takes anywhere between like 11 and 15 minutes. I only do one dark roasted coffee. And dark roasted would be actually like Starbucks' blonde roast. So that's very dark for my standards. It's actually still, by Starbucks standards, considered a light roast. So my coffees are all very, very light roasted, except for our Sumatra.
And then just for clarification, how would you define the difference between a dark roast and a light roast?
So a dark roast would, it's based on the temperature that the bean achieves during the roasting process. So our darkest roast that we do is just entering second crack. During the roasting process, you have a lot of chemical reactions going on that makes almost a flavorless bean that's really hard turn into the coffee that when you drink. So the first crack would be when the water is actually turning into gas, and it makes a popping sound like popcorn. It's very audible, very loud, so it's easy to distinguish during the roasting process. And so light roasted coffee would be like anywhere from the end of first crack up until a couple degrees past the end of first crack, which is where most of my coffees are roasted. That gives you, you can taste all the different flavors and the processing methods of the coffee that way. Once you get into the darker roast, you're primarily just tasting the roasting process and not specifically where the coffee was grown and how it was grown. So whenever you take, I always compare it to steak. It's an easy comparison for most people. If you have a flank steak and a filet mignon and you char both of them, they're both going to taste the same. Whereas if you do a rare flank steak and a rare filet mignon, it's going to be a world of difference between them.
Right.
So when you have these incredible coffees from all over the world coming in and you just dark roast them all, it's essentially just covering up all the work that's gone into the coffee. But Sumatran coffee has like a very strong musty flavor to it. If I were to do a light roast on it, it would not be appealing to most people. You take it into a darker roast and a lot of the origin's flavors are still there just because they're so strong and predominant in the coffee. But you can mellow out the unpleasant flavors in the Sumatran coffee by doing a dark roast on it. So our Sumatran coffee is actually one of the most popular coffees. It's very robust flavor. It's a very unusual coffee, but it appeals to a pretty big audience. So a lot of people like it.
How do you, what inspires you for the different flavors in coffee and such? Like, for example, Dave and I, a few weeks ago, sat down with Chris at the Devil's Trumpet Brewing Company in Maryville, Indiana. And Chris is a lifelong musician, plays in bands. And he when he was developing his beer flavors, talked about how a lot of it is music inspired, right?
Gotcha.
Like he sees the process very much like how you would build a song, or how he would write a song, or how he that's how he sees it. Is there anything that inspires you particularly to the flavors of coffee, or do you just have a really keen idea of how exactly you want it to taste and how you want how you want it to brew?
Well, so I tend to have a little bit different taste preference than a majority of coffee drinkers would. I like very sweet, very flavorful, unusual flavors in coffee. And it was actually one of the big realizations that I had to come to after I started my roasting business was that's not what most people want. Most people want just a really good cup of coffee that doesn't like shock them when they take a sip. So the Central and South American coffees, the Guatemala, it's exactly what you'd expect coffee to taste like, but it's just an exceptional coffee. Yeah, I mean, I develop my East African coffees more to my taste preferences, and just try to draw as much like fruity sweetness out of them as possible. And again, that takes dozens of roasts
and
to
that's
figure
the
out.
roast profile, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So can you walk us through the process of actually developing a roast profile, and where do you start, and how do you know when you're done?
Yeah. So the first couple times I roasted coffee, new coffee, I'm actually, even every year that I get the same coffee in, you're just finding out how the coffee is going to react to the heat. Based on the moisture content of the bean, how it is processed, how it is grown, where it is grown, is going to determine how it reacts to the heat that I'm putting into the system. So they'll all respond wildly different. So the first couple of roasts, I'm just figuring out where it's going to start becoming endothermic, where it's going to be becoming exothermic, so that I can start adjusting temperatures long before that, because it's like driving down the road. You're always putting tiny little corrections in in order to continue going in a straight line. So that's generally the first couple roasts, is just trying to figure out how it's going to react. And then after I know how the coffee is going to react to the heat, then I can really start refining the process, so that I just have the development period, which is like the first crack to when I dump the roast. It's just figuring out exactly what temperature I want to take that to within a certain parameters of percentages and things like that. So I'm constantly running calculations. I have like one of those like graphing calculators from high school.
The TI
4085.
TI 85.
Yeah, there's no way I could do all these algebraic equations in my head. So yeah, even after I've developed a roast profile, there's different environmental factors every day that I have to take into consideration. So even after I've developed a roast profile, I'm still making calculations throughout the roast to make sure that I end at the same result as what I want it to be. So, but especially when I'm first figuring out a roast profile, I'm just looking at the roaster, looking at the beans, listening to the beans, and then doing calculations on a graphing calculator.
See, that's so interesting. I would never think that part of the process of like all your senses are being used, right? Like smell. You're talking about cracks. Like I would have never thought that coffee made that one cracked and it kind of sounded like popcorn, right? I would right. That's incredibly fascinating.
And then there's actually a second crack as well, which is
and you can hear it like
the second crack is much quieter. That's actually the beans splitting. So that would be what most people would consider like it's called a full city plus roast. So it'd be like getting into the dark roasted. A lot of companies will take it way past second crack, but the beans actually splitting down the center during that. So it's a much quieter, not quite as loud crack that you're hearing in the roaster at that point.
Oh.
But yeah, the first crack is very noticeable. It's exactly like just cooking a bag of popcorn.
That's awesome.
So you talked a lot about the roasting process, and you mentioned that you have like a very specific way that you want your coffee brewed.
Correct.
Can you elaborate on that? Because I'm very curious to hear about that.
Yeah. So with all the coffee shops that I work with, I offer training to their staff, especially the new employees that they have come on board, in order to be preparing the coffee the way that I want it to be prepared. I've spent hours and hours just developing the coffee to develop certain flavors in it. So I want to make sure that those are apparent when somebody drinks it at a coffee shop. So I have the coffee shop employees either come down to the roastery or I'll go to their coffee shop, and I work with them hands-on training. And the espresso machine is one of the really tricky aspects of running a coffee shop. A shot of espresso can be prepared so differently from every coffee shop that you go to. You can use the same bean at every place and it'll taste completely different. So developing a very good practice on the espresso machine, and then even down to just steaming milk. It just doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's really difficult to master steaming milk correctly. And so I work with them on those aspects, and then brewing ratios and total dissolved solids in the coffee to make sure that it's all within the parameters that I expect of any coffee shop that I work with, so that by the time it reaches the end consumer, they're getting exactly what I would want them to drink and what they would want to drink at a coffee shop. So
you're basically just teaching these people how to manage a bunch of chemical reactions
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
they get the kind of product that you're trying to sell them.
You're like the coffee Walter White.
I was just thinking that too. I was going to say that.
but that's,
Mine's a little bit more addictive though.
that's great because that's that hands-on process, right? Because you pick the beans, you roast it, you go out and you show people how Tugboat coffee should taste and how it should be prepared. Like
Right.
all that creates a great experience, right? And that's
Absolutely.
what it's all about. Anybody can go, we kind of touched on this before. Anybody can go get a shitty cup of coffee from some gas station down the street, right? But like what Tugboat is doing, you're creating an experience for people. Not only for coffee lovers, but it seems like you have such a hands-on about it for the quality and such that you want to educate people and you want to bring new people into different flavors of coffee. Because, like, right, Dave? Like before we started this, we were pretty ignorant on coffee.
Oh yeah.
Right, and I'm sitting there listening to you, and I find I would have never thought in a million years that the process to roast coffee and such, there's such intricacy in it, and that there's so many different steps. It's just something somebody like me typically wouldn't think about.
Right.
And so
right.
that's why I'm glad that you came on because our listeners out there now know all these little steps, and like. I don't typically drink coffee, to be honest with you, but I'm sure as hell going to try try the samples that you brought for me because I just find that so incredibly interesting, like the whole process. What if we want to brew Tugboat coffee at home?
So there's two really big pieces of the puzzle to making a good cup of coffee is the grinder and then the water temperature. So the Mr. Coffees, the Keurigs, all those $20 machines that you can get at the store don't produce adequate water temperatures. All coffee is supposed to be brewed between 195 and like 203 degrees. And the slurry, which is the coffee grounds mixed with the water, should always be maintained within that water temperature. As soon as you step out of that water temperature, you're going to produce like bitter astringent flavors in the coffee. So there's only a few coffee makers that are available for home use that actually have a heating element large enough to produce those water temperatures. And then one of them is actually like electronically controlled to only push the water out onto the grounds at 200 degrees. So there's one called the Technivore Mocha Master, and it's an incredible coffee maker, all handmade, and they're really expensive, but you can get the same quality coffee that you would at a coffee shop from your kitchen. And then secondly, the grinder. So a good grinder will produce very similar particle sizes. So when you grind the coffee with a blade grinder, which is the ones you normally get for like $10 at Walmart, you're going to have coffee grounds that are really small and coffee grounds that are really large, of course. So the water, as it's passing over those grounds, over the large grounds, are going to be under extracted, and then the really fine grounds are going to be over extracted. So over extracted coffee is going to have bitter flavors. Under extracted coffee is going to have like very earthy, grassy flavors, neither of which are desirable. And then a small fraction of them will be ground and extracted properly. So a good grinder will grind all the coffee in very, very similar particle size. And so those are the two really big pieces of the puzzle that you have to solve in order to make a good cup of coffee at home. So Baratza makes one of the best grinders for home use as well. It uses a ceramic burr, and the motor is completely separated from the burrs so that the motor, as it's grinding, isn't heating up the grounds and actually chemically changing the coffee. So Baratza makes a great grinder, and so also a low RPM grinder so that you're also not creating heat and friction while you're grinding the coffee.
Wow.
And then there's
I had no idea. Even like the heating element or the motor heating it up and changing things.
So a lot of the grinders, the motor's right underneath the actual grinding surface. So you're heating up the grounds and everything that I've worked to create in that coffee, you're changing.
Wow.
And then if you wanted to do more of the individual cup brewing, a lot of people do the pour over now. It's a really popular brewing device. It's like just a cone that you put on top of your coffee cup with a filter in it. 99.9% of the coffee shops that are using those are not brewing the coffee correctly, so I don't recommend those to anybody. It's a very difficult, very long process to make a cup of coffee correctly with one of those. The AeroPress, on the other hand, is by far the best method for making a cup of coffee. It applies to the most origins of coffees, and makes every single cup of coffee a little bit sweeter. And it kind of combines the elements of a French press, so you get a little bit of oils coming through the coffee, as well as the clarity of a pour over a Chemex coffee brewer or a drip machine. So it's being forced through a paper filter under pressure, and it just creates the most unbelievable cup of coffee. So the AeroPress, there's 1,000 different methods for using it. There's videos all over YouTube on how to use it, and there's also even national and worldwide championships for using the AeroPress. It's really simple little plastic coffee brewer that was actually developed by Aerobi, that made that flying disc. It's like a Frisbee without the center in it. Back in like the 80s or something. That's how they made all their money. And so they started producing this thing called the AeroPress, and that's by far the best method for making coffee. And it's like $28 for one of those, which is awesome.
So it's affordable.
Yeah, very affordable, but it only brews about 10 ounces of coffee at a time. So if you want to do a full pot for like a family or a party or something like that, the Technivorm is the only way to do it at home. But for individual purposes, AeroPress is the best way to go.
Nice. Is that Aero, A-E-R-O or A-R-R-O?
A-E-R-O, yeah.
So as far as the fruit of the coffee.
Yeah, so it's a new idea for the U.S. specialty coffee market, but it's something that's been around in coffee growing regions for hundreds of years. So when you take the beans out of the cherry, you have all this leftover coffee fruit, which has an incredible aroma, incredible flavor, a lot of sugar, a lot of sweetness to it. And so what they do in the coffee growing countries is they dry the coffee fruit and they brew it as a tea. And then whatever they don't use, they compost. They just use it to fertilize the coffee fields because there's never been a demand for it on a large scale. So I've been working with a couple different importers to start getting this dried coffee fruit into the U.S. and it's definitely a difficult, long education process. I've had a few coffee shops that have actually started serving it, but again, that requires a lot of effort from them. They have to educate people on what it is, and it's called Cascara. And then to further complicate things, there's a pharmaceutical laxative called Cascara as well. So,
not exactly something you want to be marketing, right?
right. But Cascara, the coffee fruit, is used as a tea. You brew it similar to like an oolong tea with about 200-degree water for 5 minutes, and it produces just an unbelievably sweet, smooth cup of tea. If you were to combine raisins and malling spices together and brew that as a tea, that's exactly what it tastes like. It's crazy. It's everyone's always shocked that there's a whole nother aspect to coffee that they're unaware of. And generally, everybody that's a tea drinker just falls in love with it. It has more caffeine than even black tea as well. Not quite as much as the coffee bean itself, but has a ton of caffeine, which is awesome. And it's just a really, really sweet cup of tea. Usually, even tea drinkers that put sugar in their tea or something like that, they drink this and they're completely satisfied with it as is. And then
I'm a big tea drinker.
Oh, okay.
Myself, so I'd like to try that.
I brought the wrong thing for you then.
No, it's okay. I might be a coffee drinker now.
So I've never had not mass produced coffee, so we'll find out.
Yeah,
awesome.
It's amazing.
But and then an additional benefit for the coffee shops is since it's not really finely ground, it's actually just the coffee cherry that you're steeping. You can actually steep it multiple times, and you just extend the steep time, and it'll still produce. So they can use the same exact Cascara twice, essentially double their margins on a cup of Cascara, and produce the exact same quality as the first cup. So there's a lot of benefits to the coffee shops. There's a lot of benefits to the coffee growing countries. They don't have as much waste now. If we can really start to develop a market here in the U.S. And so far the initial feedback from the coffee shops that are selling has just been outstanding. We're just trying to find more sources because it's really difficult to find coffee farms that aren't already composting it. So the one I'm getting it from right now is in Costa Rica. And it was actually the Cup of Excellence winner the last last 3 years in a row. And it's a naturally processed coffee from Costa Rica. So they dry the coffee cherry with the beans inside after it's dried for 12 hours or so. Then they take the cherry off, dry the cherry even further, and then they ship that to the U.S.
Wow.
So it's really exciting to be part of a whole nother aspect of coffee that we're introducing the U.S. to.
Yeah, you'd be early on a whole new market.
Yeah, exactly.
Getting it on the ground floor.
John D. Rockefeller coffee.
All right, Eric. So if any of our listeners are in the Chicago area and they want to get a cup of Tugboat coffee, where would we go?
So if you're out in the Schaumburg area, there's Cup and Vine, awesome coffee shop there. If you're out in like northwest Chicago, Edison Park area, there's a coffee shop bakery combination. Absolutely unbelievable place called Anagra Cafe. If you're out in the suburbs, downtown Lombard has an incredible coffee shop called the Corner House Cafe. Downtown Elmhurst actually has 2 coffee shops, both called Elijah's. And then if you're up in like Elk Grove Village and you're out for beers, they're also serving really good coffee at Salt Creek Pizza and Pub. And then if you're a little bit further south in Lisle, there's a really, really cool place where they actually do a bunch of TED Talks called Grounds for Hope Cafe. That's in Lisle. And then if you were looking for retail coffee, we work with one of the most outstanding kitchen appliance places downtown Glen Ellen called Marcel's Culinary Experience. They also do cooking classes and all sorts of really cool stuff going on there. And then the Fresh Market, also a small grocery store out of North Carolina. They have a couple locations up here in Chicago. They carry our coffee as well.
Okay, wonderful. And if you don't live in the Chicago area or in the suburbs, you can always buy coffee at
Tugboatcoffee.com.
Where'd you get the name for your company?
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah, so-
Yeah, good call. The name Tugboat came out of my family's background. I'm Norwegian. There's a lot of Vikings on my family, and a lot of my family members work downtown Chicago for John Selvig Tugboat Lines. They're diesel mechanics on freighters that are traveling all over the oceans. So it just stemmed right out of my own family and their trades.
It's interesting because I was just watching documentaries about how the Scandinavians really came here for the Erie Canal,
right?
The shipping and stuff, and I have a huge Swedish.
Oh, okay.
It's like the biggest part of my heritage is Swedish.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of fun.
Awesome.
So I don't know if we're enemies or friends, but
I don't know. It's all
Frenemies?
Scandinavian countries, yeah. No, all the Scandinavian countries are on good terms.
Tugboatcoffee.com, and you ship internationally?
We have, yeah, even to Finland.
All right, even to Finland? Okay, because I know for a fact we have a fan that lives in Sweden, and I know
Okay.
for a fact
Yeah,
we
Sweden's a big coffee
actually do
country.
have a decent amount of listeners coming from all over Europe. I just wanted to give a shout out to the guy in Sweden because he always hits me
Sweden.
up and says, when's the next episode? So, Sikander, it's coming, okay? but that's great. So worldwide, Tugboat Coffee. Eric, thank you so much for coming on. I feel
Absolutely.
like we've learned a lot. It's incredibly interesting. And as you move into the Cascar and get that running, I hope you come back and sit with us again.
Awesome. Will do.
All right. Thank you. And that's going to conclude the Nothing Important podcast. Check us out Twitter, Facebook, our own website, www.nothingimportantpodcast.com. Dave, you can stop recording.